Dragon, Wyvern or the fearsome Chocobo riders are simply just awesome. Nothing is a greater mount than a scaly, fire-breathing flying dinosaur bigger than a house that carries a fierce warrior into the midst of battle. But how would realistic dragon riders actually work? What would be their roles in combat? And in peacetime, which challenges would dragon riders face? And how would they fight? Well, let's find out. And the first thing I want to discuss are proper arms for proper dragon riders. And of this picture, where the commissar wants to be driven closer to the enemy, so that he personally can take them out with his sword, while being in a tank, which is way longer and way higher than the sword could ever hope to reach, looks ridiculous. Then the dragon rider with a sword would also look pretty ridiculous if he or she tries to attack anything from dragon back, simply because he too would be out of pretty much everyone's range, aside from maybe a flock of birds through which the dragon dives through, simply because these smaller flying creatures could maybe perhaps potentially get in range of the sword. So this is not a great weapon for actually fighting on dragon back. But still, dragon riders still should carry some sort of sidearm, in the case that they need to dismount and defend themselves. So dragon riders having a sword makes sense, but they using it from dragon back is just ridiculous. So what arms would dragon riders realistically use? Well, pretty much anything that they can wield from dragon back, that is not too heavy and has enough range to hit targets on the ground or in the air. For example, in my last video about why are orcs always depicted as such brutish warriors, I speculated that perhaps if the dragon or wyvern is able to get this hulking mass of dense bone and thick muscles even airborne for more than 5 seconds before both hit the ground, that they, since they are bigger and stronger, could perhaps wield lances that are long enough to reach other dragon riders or targets on the ground. Now this would look like a phalanx at the very least, but the orcs are maybe strong enough to wield such a weapon. And even if not, the lance could perhaps somehow anchor it to one or even many of the dragon's spikes or scaly backplates, so that they are able to absorb the impact, and if dragon scales or plates are able to absorb the force of another dragon attacking its back, absorbing the impact of a horse at full speed should be more than doable. But in any case, the lance needs not only to be long, but it also would require some extremely tough material or magic to actually make the lance sturdy enough so that it won't just shatter on impact. Perhaps the mana of the dragon could even be utilized to strengthen the integrity of the lance just before impact. That perhaps the dragon sees the lance as part of its body, as something that it can control, and as something that it needs the rider for maintaining and guiding. So perhaps, just like birds that clean the dragon's skin, freeing it from anything from, let's say, lice, to perhaps some dish-sized lizard population feasting on its back, the dragon rider is seen as a beneficial creature to the dragon. Even if it is not the wise creature it tends to be in most fantasy stories. Because in this more animalistic dragon rider scenario, there also needs to be a mechanism by which a dragon can be convinced to not only carry, but also to not eat the emergency ration on its back, and then listen to the orders given to him by this very light meal. However, if the dragon is intelligent, it still would likely need some sort of reason for letting basically something that to them is the size of a cockroach to us on its mighty body. Now if it's war, which in a fantasy world it more often than not truly is, having a powerful, that is by human standards warrior or wizard on its back, covering its backside and being able to spot enemies with a second pair of eyes and perhaps a looking glass would be beneficial. And in this scenario the dragon perhaps might even look to recruit and enlist powerful warriors or casters for his own sake, instead of being commanded by a teenager that had been prophesied to save the world. But again, even more animalistic dragons are pretty much a miniature ecosystem, and therefore a small flock of birds might catch a ride on its back, so that the dragon is perhaps used to feel something other than his own weight and his own scales on his back. And if the birds fly away, it would be usually a sign that something is approaching it from the backside. So perhaps the riders would be seen as a safety feature, and its shifting on the back signals interesting directions in which the dragon should go. And that is the mechanism of control that the rider truly has. And of course the dragon could simply imprint on the human at birth. And then over the generations, as long as the sons and grandchildren of the dragon rider are looking similar to each other and are smelling more or less the same, it could even actually grow big enough to let the grandson of the one that peeled it out from the egg ride it. And these are basically just a few ideas why dragon riding is possible in the first place and how a bond between rider and dragon could form. But anyway, we just talked about what weapons could be used. And what better weapon could there be than magic? Weightless and deadly effective. Because if a wizard is able to cast Fireball, the dragon might not only see this wingless meatbag as perhaps one of its own, but sitting atop of this mobile vantage point, this flying fortress, and being able to fling fireballs or explosion magic on savages below is not only the dream of every boomer, but also something every pyromaniac could only dream of otherwise. And if the dragon is particularly big and strong, multiple dragon riders could fit on its back. Perhaps one is seated on its head, another two riding on its claws, and perhaps yet another on the upper end of its tail, acting as essentially anti-air batteries and turrets. And if this is perhaps too high fantasy, maybe dragons could also be used to carry bombs or just stones, making them a deadly danger for anyone under them, even if they can't breathe fire. Naturally, the dragon rider will then try to take out high-value targets, such as commanders and generals, enemy wizards, or that one cook that somehow kept morale up in the entire army, despite them having to eat rats and roots for weeks on end. And this is not necessarily something that needs to happen on a battlefield, since it would be much safer to ride on dragonback towards the brightly illuminated enemy camp at night with all of its fires and activity, because concealing an entire army from a dragon would be next to impossible, since you would not only see it, but the dragon could smell the fire, smoke, and stink of humans that just walked 50 miles only to then having to build up an overnight fortification and encampment. Then the biggest tent would be set ablaze by, for example, tar bombs or something akin to it, dragonfire, or the good old fireball spell. And then the dragon would then just disappear into the night sky. This would also be something deeply demoralizing to any advancing army, and would not only not expose the dragon to loads of crossbows and archers, as well as ballistas and awake and prepared hostile magic casters, but it would also ensure that the actual time of engagement is very, very brief, and that the enemy can't really be seen, only the consequences of this mighty roar and the burst of dragon fire could be seen, heard, and smelled. Imagine this, your commander, so full of confidence, filled and proud with battle scars, and telling you about what a great army this is, and how you all will be conquerors, how you will be able to loot and pillage at your heart's content, is fried alive, fused to his still smoldering, burning and dripping iron armor, screaming at the top of his burnt lungs before collapsing to the ground. You didn't even see the dragon, you just heard its roar and felt the fiery heat of its breath before you were blinded by its sheer might and intensity. And then, aside from the screams and the panic, silence. You don't know where the dragon is. You don't know if it will come back or not. But you know, sooner or later, it will be there. And this time, it could be you who burns. As for dragon riders and dragon riders fighting each other, I think the good old bow and arrow combination would be utilized if no magic is involved, and perhaps even with magic. Bows could act as a sidearm, since they are very easy and time-tested ways to inflict damage over any range. Another thing I wanted to discuss is the topic of saddles. Dragon riders would not just sit bareback or with a horse saddle on the dragon, but with some kind of safety harness that ties the rider to the dragon and prevents him from falling off. And the reason for this isn't so much that the dragon or wyvern might simply refuse the orders of the dragon rider and try to throw him off his back, but it's because being able to maneuver. Because if negative G-forces are experienced, you are literally being propelled away from the saddle, so you need some way for your saddle to keep you in it, because even if your dragon is your best friend in the world and likes you and loves you and will always catch you if you fall at a significant speed onto a scaly or spiky back of a dragon, you would simply be dead, as much as hitting the water or ground below you at high speed. And finally, the logistics behind and the upkeep cost of dragons would be enormous. Think about it, you essentially need to keep a beast fed and content that is bigger than a house, or even a small castle or hold, and it's not a vegetarian, making it extremely expensive in terms of food cost alone. Especially because it would take decades, if not centuries, to actually raise a single dragon to maturity. So unless the realm is really powerful and rich, it would be unable to afford more than, let's say, a dozen of dragons at any given time. And finally, the dragons might not even be used for combat at all. Like the Prussian Death Head Hussars, they might look fierce, but are more or less used as scouting and skirmisher forces. And therefore dragons might also be seen as way too valuable as to risk them in battle. Instead they are used to scout the terrain, the enemy forces, check out enemy troop movements, in order to then strike where the enemy is weakest with the actual ground army. Perhaps the dragon could also be used to capture the king, still in his castle, while the prince is leading his armies, and is then simply made to surrender, in order for his daddy to not be devoured by the enemy's small but fierce-looking dragon force. For dragons would also have a great psychological impact, even if they can't breathe fire and are as dumb as the average YouTube thumbnail. Having the enemy see such a creature, having them hear its roar, might be enough to inflict a serious blow to morale all alone, without any fighting having to take place in the first place. So much like a big and impressive seat of power, a grand castle, a dragon could be seen as a tool of diplomacy, of increasing one's standing and prestige among other nations, which could be worth the dragon in and of itself. So that's more or less how realistic dragon riders would and could actually work, or at least could potentially work. And with that said, I say thank you very much for watching and have a nice day.